Friday, President Obama met with the leaders of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and he told them to be ready to receive immigrants that have fled their countries. Well, the president is also prepared to go ahead with executive action on immigration reform by the end of the summer. Meanwhile, Republicans are challenging an administration plan to house more illegal children at U.S. military bases. Joining me is Academy Award-winning actor and founder of the Dreyfuss Initiative, Richard Dreyfuss, as well as conservative commentator and filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza. It's great to have both of you guys here. Richard on remote from San Diego and Dinesh here in studio. Well, Richard, let me start with you because since we have last talked, there has been quite a bit of news and development in the area of immigration. You know, I think all of us, I'd like to believe, think that America ought to be a welcoming place. I've always said we ought to get on our knees every night and thank God we live in a country people are trying to break into, not one they're trying to break out of, and that's a good thing. But are our leaders being sensitive enough to the issue and balancing the legal aspects and the humanitarian?
I would say that we're not being told enough about either side of this issue for us to be informed enough to have a real opinion. I do think that there's a kind of ethic in the country which is on the side of compassion, and when you're talking about children, you have to be slightly more compassionate than normal. But our newspapers and our schools don't instruct us anymore in what the reasons are for these things to happen. So, in fact, I have to say, I have no opinion about a current event because we're not taught how to study them.
Interesting perspective. Dinesh, you are yourself an immigrant. You came to this country, saw it from a different perspective than many people, but you came legally. Now, when you see the issues that we're seeing on the border, which basically I don't think we have much of a border these days, how do you react to it?
Well, I agree with Richard Dreyfuss that the great puzzle here is why now? Tens of thousands of people are mysteriously showing up on the border. Now, we call them refugees. They're not refugees because a refugee is somebody who is coughed up by a tyranny in a foreign country or some sort of revolution that is causing an exodus of refugees. None of that's happening in South America right now. South America is the same as it was 10 or 20 years ago. In fact, most of the governments down there are democratic. So I think what's going on can be explained not by looking over there, but by looking right over here. Our political leadership has been signaling that it's not serious about locking the border. And moreover, it wants to give amnesty to lawbreakers in the country. So pretty soon the word gets over down there that if you show up with kids with outstretched arms, this is a country that's decent, that has people who have compassion. It's going to be hard for them to say no. So I fear that the Obama administration is exploiting the decency and goodwill of the American people in order to make a political point.
You know, Richard, the immigration situation, I think it's different when we're talking about kids versus we're talking about people from the drug cartels, criminals, potential terrorists. You know, do you have any idea? I mean, I know you said, well, you don't really have an opinion, but I can't imagine that you don't have an opinion. How do we make the distinction between the good guys and the bad guys if we don't check them when they come to the door, if we don't even have a door?
Well, if we don't check them, that means we don't check the history of the region. And to say that 20 years ago is the same as now, we had gangs killing families, and people worked against those gangs through their fathers who were then killed. And it took 20 years for people to realize that these kids were on their own, and they'd better get the hell out of there. But it's not that it's a different situation up here. It's the same situation that we've learned how to deal with or they've learned how to deal with differently. And I admit, you know, we're not supposed to take care of all the problems of the world. We are not. But when children show up at our borders and we want to turn them back to what? To the people who raped their sisters and killed their brothers? I don't think so.
But a lot of the crime that happened to these kids happened as they made the journey to America. I mean, they weren't as vulnerable when they were in their home countries, but they were really abused by these coyotes who made a lot of money bringing them to the U.S. and bringing them illegally. I think people are mad at their government, not the kids. I don't blame people for coming here. I blame the government for not doing anything to make sure that we know who they are.
Look, I have nothing but compassion for the people who want to come over. Frankly, if we lifted the curtain, half the earth would come over here if they could. But my point is, I would just tell them, look, there's a process. We're a very generous country. We let in 800,000 to 1 million people legally every year. So I understand your plight. There's a line, and there's a process. Follow the process, and you'll become a citizen.
Stay put, because Dinesh's new film that you, I hope, have seen, it's called America. Imagine the world without her. Richard thinks the film may not cover all the important parts of our history, and he'll tell us why when we come back. Stay with us. That makes it true, all right. Well, we're back with Richard Dreyfuss and Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh, the film, America, Imagine the World Without Her, that particular scene I thought was very poignant because it kind of shows that kids are indoctrinated into a version of America that may not be complete and full. Do you feel like that your film gives us a different version, a more complete picture of America?
I think what's happened is that there's a narrative that's developed in America since the 60s, and this is now taught in our colleges, but it's spread out into elementary and secondary schools. It's the idea that American history is defined by America being the bad guy. Now, take the example of Columbus that was mentioned here. The interesting thing is Columbus came in 1492. America was started in 1776. So right there, it's very interesting that America gets blamed, not only for Columbus, who, by the way, never landed in America, but the crimes of the Spanish conquistadors, the Portuguese, the French, the British. And all of this is now saddled on America. Why? I call it the shaming of America. What's happening in our schools is there's a political desire to undermine the patriotism of young people, the natural patriotism, by telling them that the American story is a story of oppression. So what I do in the film is I challenge that narrative, and I say, look, from an immigrant's point of view, it's not that America hasn't made mistakes, but all those mistakes that are blamed on America are universal.
You know, Richard, I don't know of anybody who has been more outspoken in saying that we don't know our history very well, that we fail to understand the uniqueness of America. You've seen the film. What's your reaction to Dinesh's film that tries to present a different side of America?
Well, actually, it has a title that says, America, what would the world be like without her? And it never addresses that question. What it does is to do a very traditional overview of America's past and say, well, other people had slavery, and other people had capitalism, and other people had thievery. It never addresses the issue of what did we do about these things.
Well, I think it did, though, Richard. Let me stop you, because I think it did. And in fact, one of the points that I complimented Dinesh on was that he said that we were the only nation that addressed slavery from within. We didn't have a country come in and take us over. That we addressed it, we fixed it. Women's rights, we fixed it. It took a long time.
Excuse me, 1 second.
Okay, go ahead.
Excuse me. The problem nowadays in America is that we're actually expected to understand American history from sound bites and from chapter headings without going into the chapter. The fact is, the United States Civil War was fought for slavery, but it was begun for union. And if you had asked the Northerners to fight for slavery at the beginning of the war, they would have sat at home and said no. It took them 3 years to get to the point of the moral level of fighting for slavery. That's a complex difference between we fought for slavery or for against slavery.
Yeah.
But what Dinesh is doing is trying to defend against any mistakes. We didn't do any mistakes that other people didn't do. That's not an answer.
Do you think you avoided the mistakes,
yes, we did this.
I was trying to make 2 points. The first point is that actually slavery was not ended first in America. The British ended slavery before we did, and the French as well. But there weren't very many slaves there. So the difficulty in America was that slavery was critical to our economy. It was driving the Industrial Revolution. So we were the only country to fight a great war to end slavery. And Emerson said this was not the revolution of the oppressed. It was the repentance of the tyrant. And what he meant by this is that the northern boys who died on those battlefields, 300,000 of them, died to secure for the slaves of freedom freedom that the slaves were not in a position to secure for themselves. That is to the moral credit of America. The other point I want to make is that reform in America is always a going back to the principles of the American Revolution. I'm not saying we didn't do wrong. Segregation was a specifically American wrong. But when Martin Luther King said, "Here's my promissory note," who wrote it? Not the segregationists, it was Thomas Jefferson. So Martin Luther King's civil rights movement would not have been possible had it not been for the principles of the American Revolution itself.
Richard, you know, I don't want to be called into a partisan discussion, because I am not a partisan. I'm neither a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative. I look to the Constitution of the United States. And I would say the most mysterious thing about me being on this show is this book is called America, What Would the World Be Like Without Her? And it never answers that question.
I'll answer it right now.
It never posits.
All right, go ahead.
I'll answer it right now. The world from the dawn of humanity was driven by what I would call the conquest ethic, that people got land and wealth by taking it from someone else. America invented a rival ethic, which is the ethic of wealth creation. If the world didn't have America right now, the conquest ethic would return with a vengeance. The Chinese, the Russians, they're using wealth creation, but they still believe in conquest. All the commerce of the world that goes across the world's oceans right now would be unsafe if it wasn't for the U.S. Navy. So the world needs America now as it has in the past.
You know, it's been great having you both. I wish we could continue the discussion. Hopefully we can another time. I love both of you. You have great perspectives, and it's a delight to have you. Dinesh D'Souza, Richard Dreyfuss, thank you for joining us.